Hello and welcome back to Science Horror. This week I'm reading the second part of a story I've written called The Reality Serum. To recap from last week, Dr. Felton is wandering around the town in a daze, having taken an experimental drug of his own devising. Turner and Slater have slipped a tracking device into his pocket and they're following him around the town. We put Turner's car in a car park and then checked Felton's current location on the map on Turner's phone. My own phone was completely out of charge. "We're going to have to get Mrs. Felton to bring us a charged phone or maybe a phone charger," said Turner. "Let's go and have another look at him first," I suggested. According to the phone, Felton was on Green Street. When we got there, we found Felton's trousers, but no Felton. "This can't be good," said Turner. "If he's stripped off, at least they'll surely have to arrest him," I said. "Don't be so sure," said Turner. "This is Cambridge. Didn't you hear about that guy who cycled around naked for a whole year before they did anything?" "We'd better find him," I said. We located Felton back at the marketplace again. He was as naked as the day he was born, and the police were talking to him. A small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered around him. As we got closer, we could hear Felton arguing with the police. "Clothes are a social construct," he was saying. We tried to tell the police that we had the antidote to the drug that was making him crazy, but they wouldn't hear of it and said we'd better all go down to the station with them. At the police station, we still weren't able to administer the antidote. In the eyes of the law, we were nothing but two unlicensed practitioners of medicine. If anyone was to give Felton a drug, it would have to be an actual doctor. They did let us speak to him at least. At that point, they still hadn't managed to get him to put his clothes on, unfortunately, but they'd tried to cover him with some sort of blanket. I think the police were conflicted about what to do. Felton was well known in Cambridge and highly respected. He'd been on TV talking about nuclear fusion. He was able to talk completely coherently. It was simply that what he said was absolutely unusual. "Dr. Felton," I said, "do you know who we are?" "You are the DNA-based protein unit known in your primitive language as Slater," he replied. "Felton no longer exists as you knew him." "Do you know what this is?" I said, holding up the little red tablet. "You want to drag me down to the level of a primitive primate," he replied. "I won't stand for it." "Your wife is on her way, Felton," I said. "Don't you want to see her?" At this he only burst into manic laughter. "What are you laughing at?" I said. "Those odd little bones that stick out in the hole you talk through," he replied. "I think he means your teeth," said Turner. We weren't able to get anywhere with him at all. Eventually Sandra arrived, and they took Felton off to the psychiatric facility at the hospital. We went along and tried to persuade the doctors there to give Felton the antidote, but they were no more receptive to the idea than the police. They pumped him full of tranquilizers, which had almost no effect. The funny thing was, once they'd put some clothes on him, Felton looked saner than any of us. Sandra and Turner and I appeared wild and dishevelled when we saw ourselves in a mirror, while Felton, who hadn't slept, eaten or drunk anything for at least a day, and was now full of psychiatric drugs, could appear entirely sane when it suited him. He half convinced the doctor that he was simply conducting a psychological experiment and perhaps had got a little carried away, but was fine now. They told us to go home and said they'd come to a decision the next day. They promised to take good care of him. The next day we all went together to see Felton. They were keeping him in a padded cell, although he seemed absolutely calm. They allowed Sandra in to talk to him, and she came out crying. She asked that I be allowed to talk to him also. She wanted someone else to see what she had seen. When I tried to talk to him, at first he didn't reply and showed no sign that he'd registered my presence. Eventually he said, "Life is merely a construct of the mind. It's all a simulation, Slater. Who is in control of the simulation?" "We are." Then he burst into laughter, and I noticed urine was trickling out of the blue trousers they'd put him in. There was nothing we could do but wait for the drug to wear off. My theory was that if it took 3 days to reach its maximum effect, it would probably wear off another 3 days after that. That meant we had probably about another 3 or 4 days before he was normal again. The following day, we received terrible news. Dr. Felton was dead. He had somehow got hold of a pen without anyone realising and had managed to push it up through his nose and into his brain. I wouldn't have thought that was even possible. Sandra was inconsolable and I had no idea what to say to her. Felton had been a good friend to me and I wished I'd had the sense to tell him not to mess around with his brain chemistry, but it was all too late for that. A week later she told me to take the tablets and find out what was in them. She wanted to know what he'd done to himself. I gave some of the pills to a chemist I know, and she was able to produce a complete structure for them, but that left us none the wiser. I showed the structure to neurologists and they all agreed that the chemical would probably bind to serotonin and dopamine receptors, and that the antidote might very well be a genuine antidote to the drug. But beyond that, they could tell me nothing. Eventually, I found someone who could get together the necessary paperwork to give it to rats. But when he eventually did give it to rats, it had no discernible effect. Given that there seemed to be no possible therapeutic use for the drug, we didn't want to give it to primates. We held a little memorial for Felton at work and most of us attended his funeral. The Times published an obituary that talked about his work with fusion and his earlier work on superconductors and muon spin resonance. I stashed the drug and its antidote in a drawer in my desk at work. We tried Felton's new coil design and it worked extremely well. We went from 70% plasma stabilisation to 85% overnight. We all believed we were extremely close to achieving full stability. But that last 15% proved highly elusive. We tried to explain the huge leap we'd made to the investors, and that staved them off for a bit, but ultimately they weren't convinced that we were really any closer to achieving full stability. They wanted to see a machine that produced more power than it consumed, and nothing less than that could keep persuading them to fund the project in the long term. After a year had passed, we were again facing termination of the project. By then, I had a tiny daughter to think about, and the idea that the project should be wound up and I should find myself looking for work at exactly the time when we were so close to achieving our goal seemed impossibly brutal. It was then that I started to think about Felton's drug. The fact is that during the first 24 hours after taking the drug, Felton had come up with a startling innovation in coil design. It was only because of that we'd been able to continue for another year. I began to wonder if there wasn't some way I could take the drug safely. The key problem, it seemed to me, was that after a certain point, Felton hadn't wanted to take the antidote, and meanwhile he'd been allowed to wander about all over the place, and the authorities had got involved. I talked the matter over with Turner, and he suggested we take the antidote and turn it into an injectable form. If I was going to take the drug, he suggested I ought to be chained by my ankle at least, and someone ought to be on hand to inject me with the antidote. I vacillated back and forth on the issue, but finally I decided to try it. The location would be Turner's garage. I didn't want Jenna to know anything about it. I told her Turner and I were going to have a run at some complex calculations and would probably need a full 24 hours to finish them. It wasn't a lie, it was just a half-truth. We put a bunch of soft furnishings on the floor, including an old mattress. Turner had a steel ring set into the concrete, and we fixed my ankle to that with handcuffs. We arranged snacks and a coffee machine. We put a microwave in there, and an old fridge containing some microwavable ready meals so that Turner wouldn't have to go out and get food. If I needed to pee, I had a jug to pee into. Turner would leave the room briefly to spare my embarrassment, but only briefly. After a maximum of 20 hours, either I would voluntarily take the antidote or else Turner would inject me. I was quite sure I'd take the antidote voluntarily under those circumstances, since after all, Turner's medical training consisted in watching some videos on the internet about how to give injections. We also had a stack of books on plasma physics, a laptop with a wireless internet connection, a box of blank A4 papers, clipboards, whiteboards, and a supply of pens. We began early on a Saturday morning. I took the pill with a glass of water, exactly as Felton had done. For the first hour, nothing much happened. Then something began to change. The first weird thing I can really remember happening is, it struck me how odd Turner looked. We're so used to looking at a human face and seeing a face. But what is a face, really? Humans are a sort of tubular structure with a bulbous bit on top, attached to a stalk. The bulbous bit contains eyes, really simply a pair of cameras, and ears, and an opening through which food can be pushed. And his teeth. What were bones doing there? But of course they crushed the food. Turner's face appeared to me no longer a face at all, but a collection of sensors and openings. I was also very taken with the way objects fell towards the ground. It simply appeared to me as though they were being pulled by a giant magnet. Everything around me began to take on a feeling of huge unfamiliarity. With one eye closed, everything looked literally like a painting, but even flatter than a painting. The light in the garage also appeared yellow rather than white, as it had before. Turner had taken to reading a book in an old deck chair, but my antics with opening and closing one eye at a time caught his attention, and then a thoughtful look appeared on what I previously considered to be a face. "How much do you weigh?" he said. I almost laughed at the idea of telling him how strongly my physical body was pulled towards the earth. I had to remind myself that such things sometimes matter to human beings, and I was still a human being. "About 70 kilos, I think. Why?" "I should say Felton was more like 85, he said. "We should have adjusted the dosage for body weight." His words annoyed me somehow. What were they really? Some waves in the air. But those waves indicated that a sentient being may try to interfere with the experiment. I couldn't have that. "It's fine," I said. "I barely feel anything." Of course, that was a complete lie, but I was beginning to feel that I ought to hide the truth from Turner. Turner couldn't possibly understand. I began to think about the reactor. Then I realised I could indeed see the problem from a whole new angle. When I thought about the plasma flowing through all those magnetic fields, I felt as though I actually was the plasma. It seemed to me that I was as much plasma as anything else. I began to scribble new reactor designs on a piece of paper. "Have you come up with something?" said Turner. I ignored him. How annoying he was. I felt that he was simply obtruding into a glorious new domain that I alone could now occupy. After a couple of hours I became aware that I was hungry, or rather, the physical organism of Slater was hungry. These nerve impulses and brain chemicals meant little to me, and in spite of the hunger, I had no interest in eating. What was beginning to interest me quite strongly was getting away from Turner. I could easily see numerous ways that it could be done. "Turner," I said, "bring me the key for these handcuffs. I'm not feeling well and I want to get some air." "I can't do that," said Turner. "You know I can't." "I need air. The drug hasn't affected me. It must have gone off. All I feel is slightly sick. Just give me the key." "Take the antidote first," said Turner. "Okay," I said, "give me a pill." He passed me a red tablet and I put it in my mouth and held it under my tongue. "Now unlock me," I said. He unlocked the handcuffs that held my ankle to the floor. "Don't you think you ought to stay here for a bit so I can at least keep an eye on you?" he said. "No," I said, and I pushed open the little door at the side of the garage and walked out into the cool air. Outside I saw sights such as you can't imagine in your wildest dreams. The drug must have affected me more strongly than it affected Felton. I wondered if he'd built up a tolerance by experimenting on himself with lesser doses of analogous drugs in the course of developing this drug. I saw the same things that you or any normal person would have seen outside that garage. Houses, trees, people, cars. The difference was, all of them appeared utterly unfamiliar. As if I were looking at an alien landscape in an alien universe. Not even the sunlight looked familiar. As for the people walking by, they conjured up none of the familiar feelings that people usually conjure in me, feelings of which I'd previously been almost completely unaware. A man walking his dog was no longer really a man, but a strange tube-shaped thing with a bunch of sensors at the top, split into two tubes at the bottom, which it used to progress along the pavement. The fact of the dog representing another slightly different arrangement of such tubes made me laugh. I could readily see why Felton had called us talking sausages. It occurred to me that the sensation of being in a space, which at that point I still had, was built up only out of input from certain sensory apparatus in my body and the light show produced by my eyes. I had considered myself to be a sort of animal in this strange world, but could I not equally well consider myself pure thought? I heard the dog walker asking me if I was all right. His words could be interpreted as words, certainly, but they were also simply noises, and noises were mere vibrations in the air. I felt no compunction to reply. He was no more important to me than a rock on Mars is important to Saturn. I wandered into the town, sometimes marvelling at the bizarreness of the world that had previously seemed entirely familiar to me, other times lost entirely in my thoughts. As for the reactor, I believe I could easily have got it working right then and there, but the problem was, the reactor was of very little interest to me. The affairs of humans had become scarcely neither more nor less interesting than the affairs of minerals. I wandered around for perhaps 2 hours, although to me the concept of time was quite irrelevant. At a certain point it struck me that it would be entertaining to turn one of the tubular things upside down and see what it did. I selected one of the smaller ones upon which to try this experiment, and was advancing towards it. I realised now, of course, that it was a young woman, when I felt a sharp prick in my arm. The pain didn't bother me at all, but the new sensation interested me somewhat. I turned and saw another tubular thing, which then resolved slowly into a human face, and then into Turner. "I took the precaution of sticking a tracker in your shoe," he said. In his hand was a hypodermic syringe, the one into which we had loaded the antidote. Suddenly I realised how close I'd come to losing everything. Jenna, my daughter, my work, my friends, even my life. I clapped Turner on the shoulder. "Thank God for you," I said, with enormous feeling. "How did you know I didn't take the antidote?" "I didn't know," said Turner, "but you were walking around randomly and waving your arms about like a lunatic, so I thought a bit more wouldn't do any harm." Later that week I showed my new reactor designs to the team. They were extraordinarily bold and innovative. I had to pretend I'd come up with them in a dream, since they were far beyond anything I'd ever come up with while awake. None of us were sure if they'd work, but we calculated it would take us only about a week to rearrange the reactor along those lines, so we decided to try them. At that point, it was do or die. Either we'd prove to the world that the reactor could at least sustain a reaction, or the project would be wound up, and we'd all be looking for something new to do. After we'd finished the reconfiguration, we assembled at midnight on a Sunday to fire the thing up. We'd selected the time to minimise the risk to other people at the science park if it went horribly wrong. Very few people were there at midnight on a Sunday. Ridley gave the word, and Turner pulled the 3 massive levers that activated the machine. There was a huge, deep rumbling sound and a blue flash. Then electric arcs started appearing everywhere. "Switch it off!" shouted Ridley in a panic. Turner pulled the levers back, but the only thing that happened was that the entire reactor started to glow with a ferocious white heat. "Evacuate! Get out of here!" shouted Ridley. Someone hit the panic button and the alarm sounded. The alarm was site-wide. It sounded over the whole science park, which had always seemed a little excessive to me, but now I wasn't so sure. We ran out of the building about as fast as we could and kept running, past the car park. Behind us, an enormous electric glow seemed to appear abruptly around the whole building. It reminded me of one of those toy plasma balls when they get a crack in them and don't quite work properly. Then amazing purple arcs of lightning started shooting out of it. Finally there was a blinding white flash and a monumental bang, and when the smoke cleared, there was no sign of the Plazor building at all. It had been completely levelled. It was very fortunate that no one was injured in the explosion, Ridley probably thought he was ruined in that moment, and I was mentally calculating how to write my resume to make the whole thing sound more like a success than a spectacular failure. But it turned out that none of us need have worried. The UK military bought everything we still had left, all our plans, and whatever prototypes weren't destroyed in the explosion. They paid very well, on condition we never divulged the technical details of the reactor to anyone. Ridley became wealthy even beyond his considerable dreams, and my own Placer shares were bought for so much that Jenna and I will probably never have to work again. Sandra too became wealthy, although that was probably small compensation for losing her husband. My new designs hadn't stabilised the plasma, but for a brief moment the machine had generated at least 10,000 times the energy we had put into it. As for Felton's drug, that was vaporised in the explosion, along with the notes Sandra had given me on how to make it. Maybe it was a missed opportunity, but I'm not sorry it's gone. Only familiarity keeps our minds rooted in this world. Without that, the world is a monstrous thing that should never be seen by mortal man. What was it Nietzsche said? If you stare into the abyss stares back at you. It's better never to look into that abyss. I'm left with an unsettling feeling that that particular abyss, that unfamiliar, grotesque world, is always waiting for me, just out of sight, and I like these days to surround myself with familiar things. Once a year, Sandra and I like to get together with Turner, and we drink a glass of wine to Felton's memory. He was a genius for sure, but, like Icarus, he flew a little too close to the sun. Thank you for listening. Please do consider clicking the like button if you enjoyed this story. Many thanks. Next week I've got a story for you about a fungus that infects all the world's concrete, completely destroying it. Do join me next Monday for that. My name's John and you've been listening to Science Horror. Until next time, sleep well.